At 2:13 a.m., he walked back into the house. But he wasn't supposed to be there anymore. The police had already left. The family had already been told it was over. So why was he back inside? And what happened next was never fully explained. He was the good son, the quiet one, the respectful one, the one neighbors described as easy to raise. No drugs, no arrests, no violent outbursts. Nothing about him matched the kind of story investigators would later tell. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. But every perfect story has something underneath it. Something hidden, something ignored, something people explain away because the alternative feels too disturbing. And in this case, that hidden thing stayed buried for years. When investigators later reconstructed the timeline, one question kept coming back. How does someone like him become someone nobody recognizes? Because when people looked at his childhood, nothing obvious stood out. No catastrophic trauma, no dangerous reputation, no long history of violence. But the deeper investigators looked, the more they realized something else. The warning signs weren't missing. They were quiet, and quiet things are easy to overlook. He grew up in a normal suburban neighborhood. Tree-lined streets, weekend barbecues, families who waved at each other from driveways. His parents worked long hours but tried to stay involved. Dinner together when possible. School meetings. Birthday photos. Holiday traditions. From the outside, they looked stable. And maybe that's why nobody questioned anything sooner. Teachers remembered him as polite, reserved, smart enough to do well, but never interested in standing out. He wasn't popular, but he wasn't isolated either. He existed in the middle, almost invisible. One former classmate later said, "He was the kind of person you could know for years, without ever actually knowing him." And investigators would later realize that statement mattered more than anyone understood at the time, because he rarely spoke about himself. Not his fears, not his anger, not his thoughts. He listened more than he talked, watched more than he reacted. And over time, people stopped trying to look deeper. At home, he maintained routines, helped with groceries, ate dinner quietly, answered questions with short responses. How was school? Fine. How are you feeling? Tired. Always brief. Always controlled. But sometime during his final year of school, small things began changing. Not dramatically, quietly. His attendance dropped slightly. Assignments started coming in late. Messages went unanswered for days. Nothing alarming individually, but together, they formed a pattern nobody recognized quickly enough. One teacher noticed he had begun staring out windows during class. Not distracted, not bored, just distant, like he was somewhere else entirely. A counselor briefly met with him after concerns about emotional withdrawal were mentioned. The meeting lasted 14 minutes. According to records, he barely spoke. When asked whether something was bothering him, he smiled politely and said, "I think people worry too much." The counselor noted him as quiet but stable. Case closed. But years later, that single report would be re-examined repeatedly, because investigators noticed something chilling. Even then, he already understood how to appear normal, and that changed the way people interpreted everything that came later. Months passed. The emotional distance deepened. Friends described him as harder to reach. Not hostile, not emotional, just absent. One friend later recalled sending him messages late at night and getting no reply for days. Then suddenly, a response would appear at 3 a.m. Short, cold, disconnected, as if conversation itself had become exhausting. But the strangest part? Nobody saw all the changes at once. At school, he seemed withdrawn. At home, he still looked functional. Around neighbors, he remained polite. Every person saw a different version of him, which meant no one realized how much he was slipping internally. And according to investigators, that fragmentation became one of the biggest reasons the situation escalated unnoticed, because psychological collapse rarely announces itself clearly. Sometimes it hides behind routine. Weeks before the incident, his behavior became even more difficult to explain. He stopped participating in things he used to enjoy, stopped responding consistently, stopped sleeping normally. Phone records later showed long periods of nighttime activity. Searches, videos, forums, random disconnected subjects investigated obsessively for hours. Investigators never publicly revealed everything they found. But sources close to the case claimed many searches centered around emotional detachment, identity, and violent behavioral psychology. Not enough to prove intent, but enough to deeply disturb investigators, especially because nobody around him knew he had become consumed by those subjects. Then came the final week, and this is where the timeline starts becoming deeply unsettling. 3 days before the incident, his mother reportedly asked if something was wrong. Witnesses later said he paused unusually long before answering, then smiled. "No, I'm okay." That answer stayed with her afterward, because she later admitted it didn't feel real. The day before everything happened, multiple people noticed he seemed unusually calm. Not happier, not relieved, calm in a controlled way, like someone who had already made a decision internally. One classmate later described him as emotionally flat. Another said, it felt like he was observing everything instead of living inside it. That night, he returned home around 8:40 p.m. Security footage from a nearby street later helped investigators confirm the timeline. He entered the house carrying his backpack, stayed inside for roughly 40 minutes, then left again around 9:26 p.m. Nobody initially considered that detail important, but later investigators became obsessed with it, because no one could fully explain where he went during the next several hours. And those missing hours became one of the most controversial parts of the entire case. At 11:48 p.m., a neighbor reported hearing what sounded like raised voices, not screaming, more like tension building behind closed doors. Then silence. At 12:17 a.m., another witness claimed they saw movement near the side entrance of the house. Police were never able to fully verify the sighting, but the timeline continued narrowing. Inside the house, something had shifted. Family members would later give inconsistent accounts about what happened first. Some remembered arguing. Others remembered confusion. One person claimed everything felt strangely normal until seconds before panic erupted. And that contradiction haunted investigators for years, because traumatic memory fractures under stress. People remember emotion before sequence. Then suddenly, everything accelerated. Movement, noise, fear, panic, and then silence. Not ordinary silence, the kind that feels physically heavy. One responding officer later described entering the house as walking into the emotional aftermath of something nobody inside fully understood yet. The first emergency call came in shortly after 12:30 a.m. Dispatch records revealed confusion immediately. Voices overlapping, incomplete sentences, someone crying, someone else trying to explain what happened while barely making sense. Responding officers initially believed they were arriving at a domestic disturbance, but within minutes, they realized the situation was far more serious. And what disturbed them most was him, because according to multiple officers, he didn't behave the way they expected. He wasn't hysterical, wasn't aggressive, wasn't trying to flee. He appeared emotionally detached, almost calm. One officer later testified, it was like he had already separated himself mentally from the situation, and that single observation changed the entire direction of the investigation. Because investigators began asking a terrifying question. Was this emotional collapse or emotional disconnection? First, the case seemed simple. A tragic psychological breakdown. A young man overwhelmed internally until something irreversible happened. But the evidence complicated that theory almost immediately. The timeline didn't fully align. Certain reactions felt inconsistent. Witness recollections contradicted each other. Small details inside the house raised difficult questions. Then investigators discovered something unexpected. Private journal fragments, digital notes, search history entries, not dramatic confessions. Something more disturbing, emotionless observations, detached thoughts about fear, control, human behavior, emotional numbness. One note reportedly included the line, "I don't know when I stopped feeling connected to people." That sentence deeply affected investigators, because now, the case no longer looked purely impulsive. It looked layered, possibly long developing. Psychological experts later reviewed portions of the material. Some believed he was experiencing severe emotional dissociation. Others believed he had developed an internal identity split between outward normalcy and hidden detachment. But there was no universal agreement, and that uncertainty became central to the entire story, because people desperately wanted one clean explanation. Instead, they found contradictions. Friends defended him passionately. They described someone quiet but harmless, sensitive, emotionally overwhelmed, misunderstood. Others described something colder, a person who observed people more than connected with them, someone emotionally distant long before the incident. And investigators themselves became divided. Some believed the event resulted from a sudden mental fracture triggered by accumulated emotional pressure. Others believed warning signs had existed for years, hidden beneath routine behavior. But perhaps the most disturbing detail emerged during reconstruction of the final hours. Investigators concluded there were moments where intervention might have been possible. Moments where someone almost noticed, a teacher hesitating over a report, a friend sensing emotional absence, a parent recognizing something strange in his voice. But every moment passed, because nothing looked dangerous enough at the time, and that realization devastated people afterward. Because hindsight transforms ordinary moments into warnings. As media coverage grew, public reaction split into two extremes. Some people saw him as deeply broken. Others saw manipulation hiding beneath silence. Online discussions exploded with theories: psychological breakdown, suppressed rage, hidden trauma, personality deterioration. Experts appeared on television attempting to explain how someone seemingly ordinary could become psychologically unrecognizable. But no explanation ever fully satisfied people, because the case triggered something deeply uncomfortable. The realization that severe emotional instability does not always appear dramatic externally. Sometimes it looks functional, quiet, polite, normal, and that terrified people, because it forced families everywhere to ask themselves impossible questions. Would they recognize emotional collapse in someone they loved? Or would they mistake it for stress, fatigue, introversion, temporary withdrawal? Investigators spent years reconstructing the emotional timeline, trying to identify the exact breaking point. But they never found one single moment. Instead, they found gradual deterioration. Tiny, unnoticed fractures accumulating silently over time. And according to psychological analysts, that may be what made the case so dangerous. There was no explosion at the beginning, no obvious warning siren, only slow emotional separation. One expert later explained it this way: people expect psychological crisis to look chaotic, but sometimes it becomes dangerous precisely because it looks controlled. That statement stayed with the public for years, because it reframed everything. The silence, the calmness, the emotional flatness. None of it necessarily meant stability. Sometimes, it meant detachment. And then investigators returned to the strangest detail of all. 2:13 a.m., the moment he walked back into the house. By then, police had already partially secured the scene. Family members were separated. Initial statements had already begun. So why did he return? Some investigators believed he was disoriented. Others believed he was emotionally disconnected from reality. But one theory disturbed detectives more than any other: the possibility that he returned because part of him still saw the house as normal, as if psychologically, The full reality had not reached him yet. That theory was never confirmed. But it haunted the case permanently, because officers who saw him that night described someone physically present, but emotionally unreachable, like a person watching his own life from a distance. And even years later, the debate never truly ended. Was he psychologically collapsing for years beneath a normal exterior? Or did something catastrophic happen internally in a single night? Nobody could agree. Not investigators. Not experts. Not even the people who loved him most. Because every explanation left gaps. Every theory created new contradictions. And perhaps that's why the story still unsettles people now. Not because it gives clear answers, but because it doesn't. He was their son. The quiet one. The polite one. The one nobody feared. Until suddenly, they did. And maybe the most terrifying part of all is realizing how ordinary everything looked, right before it all fell apart.